morning, everyone. I am Gaurav. As you've seen, I'm the co-founder of SuperHumans. I'll probably tell you for a minute about what SuperHumans is. Before that, I was with Licious, leading their retention and growth, and I've worked for the last 7 or 8 years with multiple startups in the services, fintech, and consumer brand space. Right now, so SuperHumans is a startup which is pre-launch right now. We are developing the product. It's in the midst of HR tech and well-being markets. It's an offering for probably employees, depending on how many of you are CEOs or founders and employees. So it's an offering for employees of companies to reach their potential, to reach 100% of their potential, both in terms of personal and professional life. We'll probably launch in about a month's time from now. And yeah, we hope that a couple of you would be able to try it soon. So yeah, moving on from there, this is what we are here for today. So as mentioned, right, so retention, all of us know that it's probably one of the most important metrics or goals for a company to track. But in the day-to-day operations or in day-to-day scaling up of things, it kind of gets missed out. So how important exactly is it? So in the process of the next 60 odd minutes, what I'm planning to cover is, one, how important retention is. I'm sure most of you know how important it is, but exactly how badly or how greatly it impacts business day-to-day. How could you measure retention depending on the businesses that you're a part of? So what I've seen is that, because I've been in 4 industries that I've, in the last 8 years or so, different industries need to develop or understand their businesses differently. While if you look at retention, it is more or less measured the same way across. So how could you probably double click depending on the business that you're in and come up with your own KPIs, your own measurement techniques, which suit the kind of business that you're part of. And from there on, maybe a couple of case studies which probably take you deeper into certain specific use cases on retention. So yeah, this is the agenda of the presentation. We'll probably take 50 to 60 minutes covering this and then leave about 15-20 minutes for Q&A right after that. Yeah. So how important it is, right? So if you look at, if you own an app or if you're a product leader or a marketing person today, or a CEO or a founder, you come up with an idea and you probably think that it's, one, there is a lot of, how do I put it? There's a lot of confidence in a lot of us saying that we are out there with the best idea possible. When I came up with my idea, which is SuperHumans, we were also very confident. So we spent about 6 months researching the idea to probably make it the most novel it could be. But even after that, there are about 10, 15, if not hundreds or thousands of competitors out there. There are 4 million plus apps on the Play Store listed today. No matter which category that you're a part of or which business that you're running, you would have multiple competitors, tens if not hundreds or thousands, which are gunning for the same market share. The consumer of today has at least 10x the options that they had 10 years back. So it becomes more and more important by the passing day to latch onto the consumers that you have, that you're able to acquire, and scale them up from there. Not just that, this is a study which was, I think, done by Greylock Partners, over 500,000 apps. On an average, each app, or most of the apps, lose about 80% of their users that they acquire in the first 3 days itself, right? So it's not just about the scale of competition out there, it's also about the attention span of users. You might be in a product which is very good, which delivers value to the customer that is expected of the product, but if it's not able to do it in the optimum amount of time that the user needs it in, you are bound to fail. I mean, there is no easy way to say that, but if you're not able to deliver the value of the product in the time span that the user needs it in, your app is going to get uninstalled, and there is no way you're going to get that user back, apart from spending again in reacquisition or making the user revive again. So most of us know this. I'm sure most of us have looked at the impact of how retention drives your top line or profits or overall MAUs or DAUs, right? Could anyone take a guess? So these are two scenarios, right? Company A acquires about 5 million new users per month with an 80% retention, which probably, depending on the industry you come from, could be good, right? In a similar industry, company B acquires about 2.5 million with a 95% retention rate. Could anyone take a guess what is the graph going to look like probably 36 months down the line? Just the scale, which company is going to be with a larger top line or a larger MAU number, and by what margin? So yeah, right after 3 years, company A is going to have about 25 million MAUs, while company B has 42 million MAUs. Whereas company A would have spent at least 3x or 4x the amount in acquiring those number of customers, because you're acquiring double the customers every month for 36 months. You end up with just 25 million users. Now, this scenario makes a lot of sense for folks who are from entertainment or gaming industries. But if you're from e-commerce or any other industry, right, you could replace that number with the top line number. So the revenue, if you keep everything else constant, in the same scenario, company B would have made $42 maybe million, right? Whereas company A would have made 25 million. And you wouldn't see the difference, or if you're not sure if this works. So you wouldn't see this difference or observe if you're not monitoring this metrics closely till the time you hit this inflection. Because that's when you realize that it's probably not going in the direction that you planned it to go in. So retention is not just a standalone metric, it's a factor that multiplies with most business metrics that you're monitoring, be it revenue, be it your LTV, or not LTV, but revenue per employee, per user, right? So it is a fact, it's not just a standalone metric, it kind of gets multiplied with all key matrices that you would be looking at as an organization. Now, yeah, it's very important, it's good to look at it, but just to kind of start at the right note, what is retention, right? So retention in layman terms is nothing but, let's say you get a user today, how many X number of users today, how many of those users are you able to bring back to the product in a specified period of time? Depending on the industry that you're in, this could be a specific day, this could be a month, this could be a year, or could be a week. This changes depending on the stage of the product, on the industry, and at times also depending on how much data do you have on your users. How many of us are aware of this method of measuring retention? I believe most of us, right? But is this the only way? The thing that I'm coming to is, when retention is so important, how do you exactly measure it so that you don't miss the gaps or the leakages that you have in your user bucket? End-day retention is probably the most common and standardized way of measuring retention. But it just does not end there. And what end-day retention is basically how many, let's say, for folks who are not aware of it, let's say you acquire 100 users on day 0, which is today. How many of those users are coming on day 2, day 4, till day 28? On that day specifically. So in this case, about 24 users are coming back on day 28. As I said, so it's not just end-day retention, right? Depending on which industry you're a part of, there are 3 broad ways that you could look at the number of users that you're retaining. End-day retention is one of them. And I'm sure most of you are aware of it as well. The next most widely used is probably post-end-day or unbounded retention. What that means is, if you're acquiring X number of customers today, what number of your users from that set are coming after end days? So for an e-commerce company, that would mean, let's say I acquired 1,000 customers in January or in Feb of 2020. How many of them are going to come in post-Feb? or post-March. That's another way of measuring it. The third way, which is very important, and it depends on how much data you have and how much do you understand different consumer cohorts, is what number of users typically come back in a period. So you acquire, let's say, 1,000 customers in February. How many of them come back between March and April, which is the first quarter after acquisition? These numbers, in terms of just the period or when you are acquiring them, vary a lot depending on if you are in e-commerce or in gaming or in entertainment or, let's say, a ride-hailing startup or an organization. These are the standard practices or the industries at which this becomes more and more important. So ND retention, as I mentioned, typically works for social media, gaming, or broadly for products which you could expect as a daily use case. So let's say news apps or your Instagram or apps which you expect users to use at least once a day. This becomes a very predictable mode of measurement. Post-ND is for organizations which don't have that predictable behavior as a part of their cohort. What I mean by that is you would have multiple sets of users as a part of your overall cohort which come and behave very differently. So if you consider an e-com example, there are people who would, let's say, apparel, right? So there are people who buy apparel twice in a month or thrice in a month, but there are people who buy thrice in a year. So if you start measuring ND retention for them, it is not going to make sense. So your retention is going to look extremely low than what it is, right? On the other hand, let's say you are a niche newspaper app or a niche news app which publishes on specific topics, but at a larger interval. So you publish only bi-weekly or you publish only monthly. For them, ND retention does not make sense at all because you're going to see a graph which has peaks probably just 2 or 3 times in a year or in a quarter, right? Time-bound retention is great, but when you know your users well. So if you know your cohorts really, really well, which is if you're in an e-commerce scenario, if you have the data and if you're able to bifurcate those cohorts saying these are the users who typically come back for these categories X number of times in Y days, you could bifurcate those users and then monitor time-bound retention for them because it gives you clear idea as to in which period is your consumer engagement lowest or where are they most likely to drop off. So this was an overall measurement of retention, but what after this, right? This is a very top-down approach where you could just look at it from a directional point of view. It just gives you an idea of where things could be wrong, at what time period you need to focus on your consumers more. But post that, when you look at your own business, so for example, if I give you a malicious example, meat as a category was very, very new, right? Very few people have done meat online, and that too, very few people would have done it as a fresh product. So we had to go through an entire process of identifying our own matrices. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is a framework of sorts which you could use to come up with key matrices after you've looked at your ND retention or post-ND retention or whatever works for your business. What are the next key top 2 or 3 matrices that you could form for whatever business you're a part of? Now there are 3 things to it, right? So how do you come up with key matrices, right? So the first thing is a key event. A key event is the action which you want your users to come and perform every time they open an app. So that's the ideal state scenario, which is for, let's say for a news app, it could be coming and reading an article. For me at Licious, it used to be coming and browsing a product. For a ride-hailing app, it could be searching for a vehicle or searching for a cab. For certain products in e-commerce, it is buying, where the decision-making process is very simple. It's as simple as charging for the product or purchasing a product. The second point, which is very important, is how does it align with your business objective? So let's say, my key event in general terms is purchasing a product, but as a business goal, depending on my retention curves, what I've seen is that we are trending extremely low on engagement. My business goal of today could be driving more and more time spent on the app or drive more and more engagement. So it's not just about the key event, it also needs to tie well with the business objective that you have in the current time and space. Third, which I covered, was type of business. So depending on which business you're a part of, are you selling products online? Are your products engagement products? Is it an OTT platform, or is it a ride-hailing company, or is it just a SaaS product? It depends a lot on that. You can't just take a use case from one industry to another. Now, defining a key event, while it seems very simple for a business use case like an e-commerce company, it could be as simple as charging a product, but it's not that simple, right? Because the key event itself changes a lot depending on the cohort that you're working with. So ideal state is what we talked about. In an ideal scenario, the action that you want the user to take every time that they're coming onto your platform is the ideal state or ideal action or key state. Business goal is, in this point of time, what is it that the overall business is planning to drive? And the third thing, which is very important, is user behavior, which is how predictable or how different are your user sets. For an e-commerce company or for a meat brand that I was a part of, there are different, so at Licious we had about 60 odd cohorts. Depending on the business that you're a part of, the behavior of the users are very, very different. So there would be users who buy multiple times in a day for an e-commerce company or a grocery company. There are users who buy thrice in a month. There are also a set of users who are very predictable, but they buy only once in 2 months. And it is very important for you to understand and have data around those user behaviors so that your key events are not just at a company level, but at a cohort level. So if you have enough data, you could actually define retention metrics differently for different cohorts. So let's look at a couple of examples, right? Sorry. So 3 key categories, right? So if you look at dating as an example, the user action that a user is supposed to come up and perform, if you take a Tinder example or if you take any other dating app, it is swiping profiles, right? The event in that case would be swiping an X number of profiles or swipe one profile. A similar example in fitness would be that a user comes on the platform and books or looks for a fitness class. It could also be just looking up a fitness class, and you define an event associated with it. On gaming, it could be coming up on the platform and starting a game, or depending on the format of game that you're in. If it's a short format game, it could also be completion of a game. So that's the idea of identifying key events for different sets of users. So if I give another example apart from this, if, for example, at Licious, we started looking at blog as a separate product for us, where while the entire objective of the business was also to drive transactions, one part of the team was also looking at just the blog retention. So in that case, my key event, which was transactions for overall set of consumers, does not work for that cohort. The key event for that cohort is coming and looking at articles or coming and looking at the blog posts that we do. So for them, it was scroll depth that we were monitoring. So similarly, in that case, the key event for your cohort would change. I'm not sure if you guys have got a worksheet that was... Okay, cool. So probably we'll move ahead. I'll give you another couple of examples. I was planning to give this as a small task of sorts, but depending on different business types that you look at, it changes a lot, right? So for e-commerce, it could be order placed as a key event. For on-demand video, it could be something like 15 minutes viewed, or it could be an episode completed for a Netflix or for an Amazon Prime. And for an investments platform, for a fintech, it could be just completing a KYC or completing their transactions, or depending if you're a trader, if you're a trading platform which enables users to come and do active trading or intraday trading on a daily level, it could also be just monitoring your portfolio. So we covered the key matrices that one could look at. That does not give you the entire picture, right? Because as I mentioned, so one is different set of cohorts that you could look at. The second most important thing there is the usage cycle. So each cohort or each organization, depending on how many products you have under it, there is a usage cycle which is to an extent predictable for a set of users. So if you look at this example, it typically falls somewhere. So the columns here are days. The first column is day 0. If you look at the overall matrix, day 7 looks like a usage cycle for this product, which means that about of all the people coming back and visiting the platform again, about 2% of them predictably come on day 7. For certain products, this is evened out. Let's say for a gaming product, this could be evened out at 2% across days till a day 15, and then it drops off. This gives you a clarity on the matrices that you're measuring, what is the time period that they should be associated with. So if you're looking at, let's say, purchases, should you look at purchases at a day level, at a week level, at a 15-day interval, or at a month level? The thing is, for example, for Licious or for SuperHumans or for any company, if it's not a daily use case, the problem with not knowing your usage cycle is this. So what you would end up doing is measure an end-day retention or an aggregated retention curve for users, and it would show up something like the blue curve that we look at here, where you would observe that at a day 30, your retention levels or your end-day retention is close to about 10%. But in reality, your product has a use case which is only bought maybe once a week, or once in 2 weeks, or once in a month. In this case, it's a weekly use case, a weekly product, which is more or less the case with grocery or a large cohort for grocery. If you plot it as a weekly retention curve, you would see that there is a significant difference between the two curves, right? So if you're doing it the way with an end-day retention curve for a grocery category or for any category which has a weekly use case, it would not make sense, or it would not lead you to the right directions that you want to go to. That's where usage cycle becomes extremely important. So let's look at an example. I think we still haven't got the papers, but yeah. So this is a news app, one of the largest news apps in the world in a way. It has about 5 million plus downloads, is rated really well on the Play Store, so rated about 4.6. The business objective, or the objective of today, is to increase engagement. That's the hypothesis that the company is going ahead with, is launching 3 vernacular languages in our country to increase engagement of the current set of users, because they feel that there is a huge overlap between users for whom English could probably not be a primary language. So what are the 3 matrices that they would start looking at to arrive or to come to a conclusion that has engagement over a period of time improved or not in comparison to this change? The key event here is articles read, right? So a news app The primary use case is for you to come and look at articles. Depending on the app it might not be articles, it could be cards, it could be just headlines, it could be the mode of communication of content could be different. But let's say in this case it was articles read. So I would not look at just the absolute numbers. These are the three things that probably made sense to me, which is articles read per user, not just absolute number of articles read, but at a user level, because the objective here is to identify if the engagement in your current cohort or existing users is increasing or not. So increase in the number of articles read could be because of multiple reasons. It could be because you changed, let's say you launched a new language, which is Kannada or Tamil or Hindi for that matter, and you started acquiring more customers organically, which you weren't earlier, which led to a higher number of articles being read. The second is delta in reading time. This is not a direct metric, but there is an underlying gap which might come in because of change in language, which is, I'm not sure if the same number of words in a language, let's say a typical average reading cycle is about 300 words in a 5-minute period or in a 4-minute period for English. I'm not sure what that is for Hindi. It could be about 100 words or could be 1,000 words. I'm not familiar with that language, so this is a metric that I would want to look at, which will give you a correlation. So to make my point clear further, let's say a language which is Tamil. Users typically read it faster than English, right? So if I'm reading it faster, I come and spend the same amount of time on the app, but I'm reading more articles. The other way around, a language which you read slower, you are reading the same number of articles, but spending more time on the app. How would you read that? Is it more engagement, or is it a higher engaging change, or is it lower engaging change? The third thing is, which is a standard metric for a lot of companies to measure engagement over a period of time, is DAU by MAU, which is your daily active users as a percentage of your monthly active users. What that measures is, does the change effectively bring more number of users over a period of time on the app as a percentage compared to the change, compared to before the change going live? So we've looked at a couple of things so far. We've looked at how could you measure retention. We've looked at how could you identify key matrices for your own business or product or an app. We've also looked at a couple of use cases as to how data could help you in identifying your user behavior or cohorts better. The next thing that I want to talk about is a retention lifecycle. So different organizations look at it differently, but more or less there's about 3 or 4 different stages that you could identify and use for building your own life cycle for the business that you're part of. So one is new users. We all know it. The largest drop, as we covered earlier, the largest drop in retention or in terms of users coming back happens in the first stage itself, which is right after you acquire a customer. The largest drop in terms of percentage terms happens between first and second transaction, or first use and second use. So new users becomes a very, very important stage. The second is active users. Active users clubs all the users that have adhered to a simple threshold of the product, which depending on the category that you're a part of, could be a day or a month or a week. What that means is anyone who's coming and using my product over a month is an active user for me. For a news app, it could be anyone who's coming and using the product over a week could be an active user. This includes everything from a passive user to a core user, which comes and uses it extremely predictably and an X number of times which the product is expected to be used. And it also includes power users, which are looking at all the features that you have available and probably are the most stickiest users that you have. The third is revived users. So revived users are nothing but users who were once falling in the active bucket, but for some reason dropped off or became dormant and then have come back again. So for any product manager or anyone in the marketing team who's looking at retention, this is where the life revolves around, right? So these are the 4 key stages that you look at. I'm specifically not getting into churn because it's a big enough topic in itself, which would take an hour or so to discuss. But the idea here is what you need to do overall is get your new users as fast as possible to becoming active users. Get your resurrected users back into their old behavior and become as active as they were earlier. While doing all of this, also focus on users who are active, who are coming and using your app, but not to its full potential. And those are the power users that we're talking about. But this is a lot for any manager or any team to look at, right? There are always 5 or 6 different areas that you could work on. How would you go about choosing what to work on or what to prioritize for your own product? This is a very standard way that you could probably split any product. So the columns here read number of users. The second column here is as a percentage of active users. So the entire set of users that are coming onto your platform, what is the split of them across these? So what you look at is from your active users, what's the contribution from your new users? What's the contribution from your current users? Current users are nothing but month-on-month active. The third is resurrected or revived. For this example, I have clubbed it. And in an ideal scenario, if you have enough information, these should be looked at differently. Revived user is a user who had churned, but now has come back again. So if you look at these 2 examples, right? Yeah. So if you look at product X and Y, which would you think is doing well? Any guesses? Of the 2 products, which product is doing well? And for each of the products, which is the part or which is the stage which the team or you as a professional should focus on? Okay. And if you have to work, so let's say there are enough people who work on product X's as well. What would a team working on product X focus on versus a team working on product Y focus on?
For X is journey from new user to current user. Right. So why it should be more focused?
Sure, so there are 2 ways of looking at it, as he mentioned. So product Y could focus on scaling new users, if I got that right. And the other way of looking, so the point the gentleman is making is probably product Y could also acquire a lot more users to have the distribution look like product X. The second way of looking at it is that product X probably does not have great retention, which is why it has 75% contribution from new users to the overall base. Now, depending on the use case that you look at or organizations that you look at, both scenarios are possible. More often than not, it is that product X has a higher churn, which means that your net growth or absolute growth for the product is close to 0, right? So a simple way to identify where you are at, because you know your business well, for an e-commerce organization or for a brand like the brands that I've worked with, this framework gives a clear view, and not just as a snapshot view. This could be actually plotted as a trend and monitored month on month to understand, are you going in the right direction? And so both the scenarios that we discussed, you could definitely get into a scenario where for certain months your new user contribution significantly shoots up higher. That could be for multiple reasons. That could be for a marketing campaign that has just gone live. That could be because you launched a new city. That could be because you launched a new category. So keeping all of that in mind, this gives you a clear report card in a way to understand if the health of your user set is going in the right direction or not. What we could focus on, that's easier said than done, because a lot of us look at retention this way, right? So either this way or, as we discussed earlier, classic end-day retention, right? This is a format that I have personally used a lot across the companies that I've worked at. For folks who are not familiar, this is a more or less standard view of viewing a cohort. You have months on either side. This is for a month-on-month scale. X numbers of 100 users that you acquire in April, how many of them come back across different months? Different organizations, some do a transpose of this, some view it left to right, some view it top to bottom. So this is one way that I have looked at it. Some companies look at it this way, the others look at it in a curve form. The problem with this is that it does not give you the entire picture. The biggest problem here is that you're clubbing users over a period of a month or at times 6 months or a year and saying how is your retention moved. For mature companies, they look at it quarter on quarter or at a 6-month interval, where a lot of gaps at a month level would get missed. How do you solve for it, right? So a good starting point in terms of getting the second layer of information on your users is the RFM model. RFM is nothing but recency, frequency, and monetary. There is a standard formula that you could use for it. I would not suggest you to go ahead with it. Typically, it is more relevant and more impactful if you identify those percentiles or quartiles for your own business. The scale here for folks who probably have not seen this before is, this is the recency scale, this is the frequency scale. Monetary is something which is the accrued LTV of the consumer today. So how this works is you plot this for your entire user set. You have a recency, frequency, and monetary score, which you could define for your own organization. So let's say you could define a 90 percentile, 75, 50, and 25 as 4 different benchmarks, and you assign a score for each of your users, depending on which they would fall into any of these categories. So these are nothing but segments. So champions are users who are your power users. Loyal and potential loyalists would typically fall into your active buckets. And the left column of this is your potential churn or users who've already churned. So rather than looking at an end-day retention or a 6-month retention for an overall user set, it makes a lot of sense to start looking at users from this standpoint. And the entire objective of a team or a person could be aligned to this, where you not just look at segments this way, but you also look at transitions. So the objective of someone who's looking at retention is always to go from the left, the left quartile to the rightmost, which is all you get all your users to either move to the bucket on top of them or to the right of them. So we looked at RFM. RFM typically buckets users basis their past behavior, and it's also known as behavioral segmenting in a lot of, so it's a way of past behavior segmenting. So a lot of people also call it behavioral segments or behavioral cohorting. But what it does is, it would bucket these two users in the same way. So let's say for an organization that I was a part of, we would bucket these two users in the champion segment, because both of these users have, let's say, ordered 100 times, depending on which organization you're a part of. You could call it read 100 articles or watched 100 series. They would put both of these in the same bucket. So the question here is, should you be treating these two users same? With the information available right now, most of us would say yes, these are the same personality types, these are the same users, we should probably be engaging with them in the same format, in exactly the same format as we do. Would that change if I gave you this additional detail? So, how would it change?
What is the average for that demographic you're trying to choose? So we had to compare it alongside those demographics.
Exactly. So one layer is demographic details, right? So for that specific cohort or that age group, what is the average frequency? It gets more interesting. It's not just this. For a lot of products which are digitally native, we have a lot more data. What if I told you this? That Ben is single, probably in his first job. Jay has a family and is at a different curve in his career. Right? If you probably go deeper, and let's take this example as a food ordering app. Ben generally orders when there are deals around. Jay typically orders with a very, very predictable pattern only on weekends and mornings. So it's not just about the past behavioral segmenting that I talked about earlier. Depending on which demographic you're a part of, which psychographic segmentation that you're a part of, and for certain use cases, which geography do you fall in, the treatment that a cohort needs is very different. So it's not just about segmenting users or starting at an end-day retention curve or an overall retention, moving from there to an RFM model. That's not enough. What eventually depends, as you mature, is you overlay the RFM segments with details like these. Some organizations have higher information in terms of their user sets around demographics or geographies. Some also have information on psychographics. So depending on what has higher contribution or higher rate of incidence for your matrices, you could choose either of these and basically look at which cohort makes more sense for you. So we've covered about 4 or 5 different things so far. Now let's get into how do you put all of this into action, because that's where the rubber meets the road in a way. Let's say I have all the information for all the cohorts that I look at. I have information on how my new user performs, how my active user performs, how my power user performs, and how does a revive user typically come and perform on the product. How do you go about creating a plan from there or creating a retention strategy for your own product? So typically there are 3 ways to look at it. One is, how do you get your new users to be your active users, which is where the maximum gap for most products is. The second is getting your active users to be your power users, which in other words is called user growth, which is if your current user set is buying maybe 1 or 2 categories from you, or viewing just 1 or 2 categories from you, how do you get them to use more of your offerings? The third, which I'm not covering today here, is how do you revive your users? So which is, let's say a user churned. A user could have churned for multiple reasons. How do you bring back that user? not going the traditional routes of reacquiring the user, right? So there are different methods that you could use to do that. These are the three broad ways that organizations look at it from. So let's look at new users first, right? So a new user cycle is nothing but discovery of value. So if you look at the curve, that's how a typical user behaves, which is you start today and you have to have the first moment of truth, which is, as a user, I identify that this product delivers some value to me. If that does not happen, you churn. Another area where users typically churn is when an onboarding fails. Depending on the organization that you work for or the product that you own, this could mean a KYC failure for a fintech firm. This could mean a failed registration for an e-commerce company or an address field failure for an e-commerce company. Two, not getting as simple or as bad as not getting your OTP for a content platform, right? So you would have spent all the money, so you would have spent all the money in acquiring that user, but you're not able to even enable them to experience your platform in the first instance. So the first thing here is ensuring that a successful onboarding happens. The second is value discovery, as I mentioned. So value discovery is a very important step in the entire user life cycle. This could differ depending on the product that you're a part of. So at Licious, we had identified that we need to have a user buy 3 of our products at a certain interval for him to have a less than 4% chance of dropping off. So there, certain set of products enabled the users to kind of differentiate the brand from the rest. For, let's say, clear tax, this could mean experiencing your first tax filing within 6 minutes or 7 minutes, right? For Uber, this could mean getting your first ride within 2 minutes. So this depends on the kind of users that you're dealing with and the product. And you need to come up with defining value for your product and your cohorts at different intervals. So for certain users today, where it could be, so we covered the Ben and G example. For Ben, probably value discovery could be, are you showing the available products upfront? For J, it could be how seamless is your checkout flow, right? So the more or the deeper understanding that we have of what value means for each of your customer cohorts, it is easier to kind of drive value to each of them. How do you go about it, right? So let's say we are at an 80% churn today. What are the steps that you would typically follow? So the first step in the journey is to kind of, as clearly as possible, define the cohorts. So the first cohort in this case would be the new users who probably came, viewed the product or transacted with the product for the first time and churned. The second set of users is the users who bought and came back again in a defined period. In this case, let's consider it to be a month. Step 2 and step 3 kind of keep changing places in my experience. That's what I've seen depending on the data that you have today. If you have enough data, it's better to do step 2 before step 3, which is start looking at drivers or behaviors or any other user attributes which differentiate the 2 cohorts. So it could be as simple as a source of acquisition, which is, if you look at a pure play content platform, it could be that your users that you're acquiring from a certain partner or a certain ad provider are performing better or are getting retained better compared to other users, where you have limited data, right? Second, it could also be things like geographies. So for example, in my experience at companies like HouseJoy, which was into services, what we saw was it also depends on some geographical limitations. So for example, an area like Greater Noida in NCR compared to an area in NCR, which is Kalkaji, Greater Noida would perform relatively better. And at that point in time, we did not have enough information. But that's a good enough signal or a good enough proxy for you to build an hypothesis and test it out. Eventually, once you test it out, so we did that, we tested it out, and what we figured eventually after looking at data and after also speaking to consumers was that one geography was performing better than other, not because of our product, not because of what we were talking to the consumers about, not how we were reaching them, but because of the existing competition there. So there are certain things which data might show you clearly, there are certain which it might not, but the idea here is to look at these matrices and develop an hypothesis which you could probably then use to formulate your outreach strategy for those user sets, and then validate it from there and see if it works out or not. It wouldn't work out probably 6 on 10 times or 7 on 10 times, but the 3 times that it does, it gives you a tremendous bump. So the second set that we talked about is active users. And this is probably one of the least focused areas that I've seen for a lot of folks working on retention in organizations. Because we typically look at either churn or new user segments because that's where the maximum gap is visible. But in my experience, a 5 or 10% jump in user growth typically gives you about 3x a multiple of that in the bottom line for that particular user. So here the active user set is nothing but users who are coming on your platform on a month-on-month level, but they are not utilizing all your categories or the entire gamut of services that you have to offer. So there are 2 objectives largely. One is increase the frequency of usage, which is from a content standpoint could be increase the time spent or increase the number of episodes viewed. For an e-commerce company, it could be just the number of transactions in a specified period of time. The second objective could be increasing depth of usage. What depth means in these terms is typically the category usage, right? So, which is, let's say you got in a user who just buys cell phones from you today. How do you get that users to buy home and kitchen? Or how do you get them to buy apparel from you, right? For me at Licious, it used to be, let's say we got a user for chicken as a category or red meat as a category. Now, how do you get that user to get into cold cuts for that matter? The process of going about this is also fairly similar, where you define the 3 cohorts. The key thing here is to define your passive, active, core, and power user cohorts separately, which is not just club all your active set in one. That's where most of the gaps happen. Identify and set a happy flow of sorts, which gives you your active cohort. So for an e-commerce player, that could be, let's say, 2 transactions a month, which is a standard use case. So that would be your active cohort. Passive cohort is someone who's coming and buying month on month, but is not hitting that 2 transactions mark. A core cohort would be probably, let's say, 2 to 4 transactions. So these are again hypothetical numbers, you need to come up with them for your business. Power user cohorts is power users would be users who are coming and probably giving you their 100% share of wallet. The second step again is the same, where you start looking at these different cohorts with their behavioral data in mind and see where are the differences. So it could be as simple as, again, the geography that they come from, the value that they see in the product, or something which is more difficult typically to identify, what are their motivators behind buying your product. And then you build an hypothesis and basically test it out. So in the example that I talked about earlier, where I talked about Greater Noida versus Kalkaji, what I would typically go about doing is start focusing all my energies on either of them. So let's say I see behavioral patterns and see that there is certain category depth which is higher in Greater Noida. I would first artificially start to push and see if I can get that number in Kalkaji as well. If the stacks, the hypothesis is invalid, what would typically happen is, even after all your efforts, Kalkaji would not move. So what you would eventually realize is that the hypothesis was true for Greater Noida, and it is something that is outside of your behavioral usage patterns that you've seen. So it is not just about the category depth, there's something else that's at play here. So let's look at a specific example for this. These are hypothetical numbers for YouTube. How would you go about defining these for your organization, right? So these are typical metrics that a content organization would follow or an OTT platform would follow. There's videos started. This could be sessions started for some. Videos completed. The number of videos that you did not engage with and scroll past. Notify set is a feature that a lot of these content platforms have. How YouTube would go about defining, or any content player, in my opinion, would go about defining these different user sets is they would categorize them on just viewers. Then there are users who subscribe. And then there is a third set of users who notify. Now, if you look at this data here, what you see is that there is a significant, so people who are using YouTube notifications for that matter, have about 2x videos, they're viewing more than twice the number of videos of the average user. They're also completing more than twice the videos compared to an average user. And they're not scrolling past a lot of videos, which means that their net usage time on the platform is relatively very high. If you compare that with viewers, which is probably your passive set of users, it is lower than average, right? And your YouTube subscribers are somewhere in the middle between the average and the power user, which is the people who are using Notify Me as an option there. Similarly, depending on the category that your app is a part of, there would be a Notify Me option which is identifiable for the product. So for grocery, typically Notify Me is that part where you capture a clear intent for a certain product, and those are the users which typically show a higher correlation in terms of being your co-users. Similarly, depending on the category that you're working with, the idea here is to identify what that lever or what that feature is for you. For a meditation app or for a fitness app, this could just be a reminder. Or for a to-do list, this could just be a feature which is a recurring reminder for that matter. Why that matters is, if you look at, go ahead and if you look at retention curves for different set of users that we just talked about, typically what happens is a power user would have a higher retention rate. So here in this case, the top line that you see, which has about a 50% retention at day 14, is your YouTube Notify Me users. While your YouTube viewers, which is the bottommost line, has about 21% or 22%. And what this enables you to do is identify the ideal paths that you want to chart for the users that you're acquiring. So for a content app like this, there are two paths that would be defined. The first one is drive viewers to subscribe, which is how do you build or change your product in a way? And how do you build your content strategy to enable each of your viewers to subscribe as easily as possible? And the second step from there again is get them to set a notification for it. So, in terms of what we've covered in today's journey so far is these 4 key things. So one is, how do you measure retention for your business? How do you identify key metrics for different cohorts that you're working with and different products that you're working with? How do you identify and set behavioral cohorts? And how do you go about building a plan or a strategy for each of those cohorts that are part of your product? So we've looked at different relatively easier options, right? So we've looked at standard ways of measuring retention. I've also kind of talked about 3 or 4 large categories that we see around us today. But for certain apps or certain categories, it's not as simple on the surface, right? So let's consider an example like a dating app. If you consider Tinder, or if you consider OkCupid for that matter, or any other dating app, the conundrum here for an app like that is the more successful your product, the lower is your retention going to be. What that means is, every time a dating app gets you a match, you lose 2 consumers. You lose 2 paying users. So for an app like that, how do you go about defining key matrices? How do you go about defining a plan? And what is it that would look like an ideal path for that app? Most of the products that we discussed or that I brought up in the conversation are products which you are expected to be a part of in the ideal scenario for your lifetime. This is a strange product or a strange problem in a way where you are expected to be a part of it for a certain time. So how would you go about defining the user cycle or the lifetime of a user for a product like this? So the idea here is that not all churn is bad, right? So there is an ideal performance of a product, and once you are meeting that life cycle goal of yours, you need to identify if the churn is good or bad, which means that is it happening for the right reasons or not. So for a dating app, these are typical 4 or 5 reasons why you could drop off, right? So you came on the app, you're not able to find a match, and you say, the product is crap, I don't want to use it. You're just bored, which is you came, swiped profiles, did not find it and went. There was some product glitch because of which you were not able to use it and you dropped off. You actually found a partner, right? So you found whatever, the one for you, and you have your happily ever after. The 5th one is you started dating casually, right? So if you look at reasons like this, these are the 2 intended reasons of churn. So as long as these 2 are happening, a product manager or a retention manager should be fine with it. The idea here is, what you will need to do is probably chart all the paths down differently. Because what is going to happen next is, if you found a partner, you're not coming back, right? But if you started dating casually, there is going to be a pattern, which means that you probably would have a dating cycle, which should be a month or 2 months or 6 months for some people, after which you would come back to the app, or you should ideally come back to the app. And what you would need to measure from there on is how many of those users are actually getting redirected. For that to happen, there are certain drivers that could be a part of it, right? So as someone mentioned, that you could probably look at enabling them converse only on the app. What I would rather do is probably look at these drivers which help me identify, have you found the one, or are you dating casually, or you've dropped off for the wrong reasons. So probably look at, was there a match before you dropped off, right? Not just that, maybe did you converse with the folk or the person that you matched with? Or did you share contacts with them? Because that gives you a higher probabilistic chance of saying that you could have dropped for the right reason rather than just because of a product glitch. So that was largely about it. Let me know if you have any questions or if you want me to probably talk about a couple of use cases that you've faced so far.